Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacy Davis. I'm with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and welcome to our first session this morning. Hopefully, everyone's got some coffee or some soda, something caffeine to get you going this morning. And hopefully, you are at the right session here. We are Rooftops, the next frontier in native plantings, a lesson from Chicago. Um, so as we go along, just like the previous days, if you have any questions or comments, just put those in the chat feature on the right hand side. And then at the end of the session, we will take some questions. So I'd like to take a minute to welcome Matt Strange. Matt's going to be our presenter this morning, and he is a passionate landscape architect who draws from his 15-year experience in both New York and Chicago. He combines urban sensibility with site sensitivity to design vibrant, verdant, and creative outdoor spaces. As a principal at Confluence's Chicago office, Matt's experienced in a broad range of project types with a specialty in overstructure projects, amenity decks, and green roofs. Matt is a licensed landscape architect in 5 states and a member of ASLA, AIA, and ULI. He also sits on the design review board for the University of Illinois at Chicago. Matt's a proud father of 4 and a self-proclaimed plant nerd. Nice. Matt is also a former performance poet, graphic designer, and youth leader. His diverse interests help inform his approach to design. So, welcome, Matt. Happy to have you this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this bright and early session. Hopefully, I can keep everyone awake and attentive. So, as said here, the session is Rooftops: The Next Frontier for Native Planting, Lessons from Chicago. Just as a quick intro, as thank you for the intro so far. But again, my name is Matt Strange. I'm a principal at Confluence's Chicago office. Confluence as a company has 9 offices throughout the Midwest, but we're really doing work all over the country. Been a landscape architect for about 15 years, working in primarily urban spaces throughout my career and in a lot of rooftop projects. So, for this morning's agenda, we're going to start with talking a bit about Chicago and the green roof movement and how really Chicago became an epicenter for green roofs in the country. Then we'll move on to talking about native green roof philosophy, native green roof realities, and then look at some case studies of a few projects that our office has worked on, and then finish up with Q&A. So beginning here with Chicago and the green roof movement, this photo that you're seeing here is actually directly behind our office. This is on the rooftop of the Illinois Center. So this is basically a public on structure plaza over a parking garage below. I wanted to start here with this quote from one of the fathers of the prairie style, really first established in Chicago, Jens Jensen. Chicago's motto is Urbs in Horto, or Latin for city and a garden. And so, as we walk through some of what we're doing in Chicago in terms of the green roof movement, I'd like to frame it through this paradigm that bringing living green into urban cities makes them more livable places. You can have all the modern conveniences and excitement comes along with a city, but having abundant access to nature and fresh air like you get on a rooftop really does change the experience in a city and makes for a better place to live. Um, Nowadays the idea of using native plants really doesn't sound all that revolutionary. But back in the early 1900s in Chicago, no one was really doing this. The predominant design philosophy at the time was that American parks and gardens should look like European parks and gardens. Neatly manicured nature, exotic plantings, a lot of structured formality. But folks like Jens Jensen really had a completely different perspective. He and others looked at the land and asked themselves what the spaces might have looked like hundreds of years before settlement. They asked themselves why everyone was trying to fight with nature instead of just using materials that naturally thrived in the area. And that conservationist perspective really helped establish Chicago today. From Jackson and Columbus Park to Humboldt and Garfield parks, the idea of forming entire neighborhoods around these wild green spaces that really gave people in urban environments access to nature is really deeply rooted in Chicago history. So fast forward several decades, and Chicago was really beginning to explode with development. But with that development came a lot of pollution. As you can see from this photo of Chicago in the 1970s, in the Loop, open space was really just thought of as an opportunity for parking or dumping or loitering. The river today isn't incredibly clean, but it was really like a cesspool back in the 70s. No one would dare think of having a river walk as we do today. Chicago really could have gone the way of so many other dense cities throughout the world and really become an unlivable industrial wasteland. The lack of green was really starting to cause all the pavement and buildings to absorb too much heat. It's a concept that I'm sure many of you are familiar with called the urban heat island. And it was making the city just not a nice place to live and experience. But in 1989, something changed. Mayor Richard M. Daley was elected, and with that change in administration, there was a big shift in the vision of Chicago as a more green and beautiful city. In the 90s, many vacant lots began to be cultivated by a program called City Space, which resulted in over 500,000 trees being planted throughout the city. There was a heat wave in 1995 that was actually so hot that it claimed the lives of a number of people in the city due to kind of extreme temperatures with this urban heat island effect, and it actually really precipitated a greater discussion on sustainability and green roofs. In 2001, a few years after that heat wave, the mayor decided to put a green roof right on top of City Hall. He had seen some green roof technology used for many years throughout Europe and wanted to bring that to Chicago. And at that time, there was, just to give you some perspective here, there was only about two companies that were even capable of doing a green roof in Chicago. But the mayor really felt it was important to say, well, hey, if we want sustainability to be a priority in the city, this needs to come from the top down. This needs to be kind of front and center. And we say, hey, we're going to be the guinea pigs here, and really send this message that this is the kind of city we want Chicago to become, a really green, urban metropolis that puts sustainability at the forefront. In June of 2004, the Chicago Sustainable Development Policy was established. The policy is a point based system that's still used today that actually requires private developers receiving assistance from the city to include sustainable features and project designs. And it's really the thing that kicked off the green roof boom in the city. As part of this point system, developers are required to have 50% of their buildings covered by a green roof at a minimum. Once they have satisfied that minimum requirement, additional points can be achieved with things like having 60% of the plantings native, plantings containing 30 different genera of plants, green roof media being 6 inches deep or more, 40% of the green roof dedicated to the production of food and different things like that. There's a lot of architectural sustainable options to add points as well, but those are really the ones that kind of affect landscape architects the most. And really kind of codifying sustainability into a policy like this was really the only way the city could get developers to take it seriously. It changed sustainability from kind of a, oh, nice to have, we'll do it if we want to, sort of a thing, to really making it a requirement. Um, so just to give you some perspective, there's now over 500 green roofs throughout Chicago. This map here is just 50 of them that our office alone has done in the loop. And there's probably 10 more that we probably should add to this diagram from when we first put it together. But suffice to say, I would say that our office probably has 70% of our projects that actually happen over structure, whether that's like an amenity deck, rooftop kind of space, or even over structure, parks, and plazas and that kind of thing. And I think that really begins to speak to how significant the Chicago Sustainable Development Policy has been in really generating more of these kinds of projects. All of these buildings that you're seeing highlighted here and the many others that are not highlighted could have just been regular old buildings and public open spaces that didn't have any green, hardly at all, that were just more parking lots, more kind of hard impervious materials. So while, of course, a lot of developers at first grumbled about the idea of having to follow this new policy, I think what they began to realize is that while, yes, having 50% of your building have a green roof, definitely costs you more upfront. They actually provide a tremendous building amenity that really increases rents and gives them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. We sometimes joke in our office that there's actually sort of an arms race in amenity decks in the city right now, where every developer is trying to outdo one another with the kind of the coolest, latest thing on a rooftop, and it's helped really evolve design on rooftop spaces. Case in point here, this is actually Prudential Tower in downtown Chicago. This is right across from Millennium Park. As you can see, that top photo, that's the site when we first arrived. It was an unused rooftop with just pavers on it. It had a really tall parapet at the edge that made it really difficult to even see the view, even if people could get out there. But it had this just dynamite view of downtown Chicago where you can see the lake, you can see, all of downtown, you can see, Millennium Park, and then now Maggie Daley Park, and all sorts of stuff. And so, as a design goal, we wanted to really raise up that space so that people were looking out over that parapet and seeing all of that view and kind of capitalizing on that, but really creating this really rich green space that now employees can use to hang out on their lunch breaks. They do outdoor concerts and sorts of things up on this rooftop as well. Really kind of capitalizing on an underutilized asset is what green roofs can really be all about. So then, as we shift here into native green roof philosophy, this photo here is actually of the British school that our office worked on. This is in the South Loop in Chicago. But I mean, you could just see in the background that there's an adjacent movie theater with green rooftop and the mechanical space. And across the street at the parking garage, you can see more green roof over there. That's how prevalent this is in the city of Chicago. So this is a school space that you're seeing below. So it's a private school, but you can access it from the ground. Um, so really making that part of the school experience. It doesn't have to just be apartment buildings and office buildings. So I wanted to start by talking about a little bit about the sustainability triangle. A lot of times we only focus on the environmental aspect of sustainability, which of course is very important, but there's also kind of a societal or social aspect and an economic aspect of sustainability. And really, green roofs have a way of addressing all of those things to really create sustainable projects. So environmentally, they do things like reduce the urban heat island, they reduce and cleanse stormwater runoff, increase wildlife habit, produce food, and create planting diversity. This photo here is an apartment building that we worked on at 2950 North Sheridan, and you can just see the amount of planted space out there that could otherwise just be a ballasted rooftop. Socially, they do things like provide access to nature, provide places to relax, talk, eat, play, and learn, reduce ambient noise, improve communal living, and then they become a common ground for different demographics. We see as a trend in a lot of apartment buildings here that people are actually moving into smaller units that have larger communal spaces. I think people generally are okay with having less space to live in indoors when you got either a massive amenity deck or other communal building spaces where they can hang out and socialize with people and have some of that space that would otherwise be privatized. This is an example here of a project. This is a Xavier Apartments here in the city, and just a group of people from the apartment building hanging out, playing bags out on a lawn area with some terrace seating. So really a social aspect to it as much of it as an environmental. And then economically, green roofs do things like attract tenants, employees, and customers, and retain tenants, employees, and customers. Give them a reason to keep coming back or a reason to stay. Reduce energy costs, create job and revenue potential, and then branding and identity for the building. I mean, and we'll go through a few more examples of this as we get into these case studies here. But really, I find that most developers don't really care all that much about the environmental aspect. Although, as landscape architects, and I'm sure a lot of other people on the call today really care very deeply about the environmental aspect. Most developers care much more about things like the economic and the social aspect. And so to just ignore those things or think of them as less important makes it a much harder sell to get a developer to think about. But when you say, well, hey, this environmental benefit is also going to help, bring new people into your facility. It's going to help generate, additional profits for the building. It's going to raise property values. All of those things are kind of the music to developers' ears. So now I want to talk a bit about green roof realities. This is a project that we worked on right along the river in Chicago at 150 North Riverside. This is an overstructure plaza, so there's a parking garage below this whole space. As you can see, a massive amount of grade change across the site, something like 20 feet of grade change with this kind of crazy switchback ramp that goes through it. So a few green roof limitations just to be aware of because they come up in conversations with developers, particularly in cities where you maybe don't do a ton of green roofs. They do add significant costs. We find that most green roofs here in Chicago are somewhere between $75 and $150 a square foot. That's for everything above the waterproofing layer. That includes things like furniture, but would exclude things like pool. And so that with a cost like that, it's a pretty substantial amount of money, and with raising or rising inflation costs and construction costs at the moment, those figures are probably actually undervaluing that square foot cost a bit. So definitely something to keep in mind. They do add weight to the building, and so especially if you're doing a green roof on an existing structure, there's oftentimes limitations for where you can have heavy things like trees or kitchen areas or that sort of thing, locating those strategically and not overburdening the structure, or in some cases needing to actually add more structure to the building so that it can accommodate a rooftop. There's definitely ongoing maintenance. Green roofs are very far from maintenance free, even with things like native plantings. There's seasonal maintenance that needs to happen, and just like it would in any landscape. And with things like green roof, you get damaged pavers or furniture that needs replacement and that kind of thing. Things like occupancy limits, usually for any green roof on structure, there's going to be a limit to how many people you can have occupy different areas. So there needs to be a certain amount of unplanted space versus occupiable. A lot of developers would prefer to have the entire deck just be like pavers so that everyone can have as much usable space as possible, but that's just not realistic from a building code perspective. And then limited consultant experience. Our office does a ton of green roofs. Like I said, we do something like 70% of our work is over structure. But in a lot of cities where there maybe are not so many green roofs, there might not be as much local expertise with how to design these spaces. And so a lot of times we've been working on a lot of projects in like Atlanta and Nashville, for example, really because we're able to kind of bring our experience from Chicago and have a Chicago developer or architect bring us along to then influence those projects in other cities that maybe don't have as much of the green roof and amenity spaces that we do here in Chicago. And then beyond just green roof limitations, there's some native planting limitations. While I think a lot of us here on the call, we were at the Planet Native conference, right? So we all appreciate native plantings and can see the value of that. But there's definitely a few things that I find with developers that become a hurdle to get through. There's definitely a perception problem for a lot of people. They see native planting aesthetically as kind of a weedy, unkempt, uncared for space, and so really thinking of how can you use native plantings in a way that don't always look like maybe a wild prairie, but can maybe feel a bit more refined for a developer who wants to see something like that. The maintenance can really require education. There's a lot of landscape maintenance contractors that really would have a hard time identifying the difference between a weed and a native plant. And so, especially in a really mixed planting environment where it's all together, having a maintenance staff that can really understand how to remove the correct materials out of there can be a challenge to find. There's limited availability on a lot of plantings. Most nurseries are carrying, cultivars of things and maybe have limited selection of native plantings, or in a size that's would look good kind of day one on installation. So that can be a challenge. There's an increased biomass with native plantings. A lot of green roofs people think about things like sedum blankets and that kind of thing. They'll generate some biomass after the plantings go dormant for the winter, but not that much, versus an area where you have maybe a ton of grasses and shrubs and all kinds of stuff, where now you have contractors saying, well, what do I do with all this stuff? I've got to cut down grasses and prune trees and all this. Where's all that go at the end of the season? I've got to haul it down the elevator, and so that sort of thing becomes a concern for a lot of people. And then stinging pollinators. While we all love pollinator gardens and the idea of things like butterfly gardens and all that sort of stuff, in a lot of amenity spaces, particularly around pools and that kind of thing, people don't necessarily feel comfortable laying out in a lounge chair and it's just swarmed with bees next to it, or that kind of thing, or I'm cooking and I can't do so comfortably because there's yellow jackets flying around. And so being really conscious of that, and making appropriate plant choices for the environment you're working in is really important. So now we're going to go into a few case studies that our office has worked on, and kind of dive deep into three projects specifically where we've applied some of these different principles. This here is at the McDonald's headquarters in Fulton Market here in Chicago. This They've got quite an extensive rooftop at McDonald's there. It's their corporate headquarters. But the first project we're going to talk about here is Port Apartments. This is in the West Loop in Chicago. And as you can see from this aerial photo, they have just a massive podium in the middle with two towers next to it. And so this is, a ton of green roof space. And what you're actually seeing on the tower spaces adjacent to that podium, the one to the right is actually for food production. So they grow crops on there, as well as the upper level mechanical part of the building. And then there's a separate area on the left tower there that's more of a sunset overlook terrace space. So some of the principles we applied here was really that this should be as graphic as it is green. As you can see, people can live up in these units up 18 stories here in the building, and so it's not really just the people walking through the space we wanted to think about, but hey, if I'm looking down from one of those tower, or from one of those units or from the adjacent towers, what do I really see from above, and how is that graphic an interesting thing to look at? Tried to create a really immersive landscape experience so that you're always walking on paths, sort of immersed in a garden, not just walking by planters. Um, Things like this area over here, where you're tucked between rows of trees and raised planters, really surrounded by plantings on all sides. So you're in this hyper urban context with buildings all around you, and all this sort of tall skyscrapers and that kind of thing. But now I can feel like I'm immersed in nature, even in that kind of hyper urban experience. As many amenity decks are built for use. So yes, there's a lot of native plantings here. You see things like panicum in the foreground. You see sumac, river birch in the background. But in the midst of all of that, there's still a lot of use for different areas. So this, we did like a custom double-sided fireplace wall with a TV screen on either side, with a shade structure. So one group can hang out on one side and another group on the other. They're watching the big game and all that kind of stuff. There's kitchen areas out there, which happen in almost every apartment building we work on. So communal kitchen spaces where people can come and grill, because in Chicago, as many places, you can't actually have your own private grill on a balcony. They only can be done with kind of plumbed in natural gas in these sort of environments. So, as you can see here, I can grill outdoors, but I'm still kind of immersed in this native planting around me. I've got the junipers in the background, and panicum and sumac and river birch and all that. This also is a very flexible environment. So what you're seeing in that bottom left-hand corner, there's a big circular lawn space with artificial turf, and then kind of a mound around the edge, and then the pool deck is also encapsulated with a mound. And in that green space, as you can see in that top left image, in the mornings it's used for things like outdoor yoga and fitness, and then in the upper right it's used for things like outdoor movies and different tenant appreciation events and parties and that kind of stuff. Things like fire pits and that kind of thing are also incorporated. And so, really having that flexibility of use to become a lot of different things. It also plays into, I think, the wellness aspect of sustainability, that it's not just environmentally friendly, but hey, we're providing an environment where people can actually work out outdoors and socialize outdoors. It's that mental health and physical health aspect of green roofs is also, I think, part of the social sustainability story. Another fun thing we did here, a lot of people, I think, have the perception that green roofs need to be flat, or that they can only be done in sort of raised planters or trays or that kind of thing. But we actually played quite a bit with grades here. All of the mounding that you're seeing is built up with geofoam underneath, so it's basically foam insulation underneath this, and then we cut out a cavity for the trees to be able to spread out in there, and then have 12 inches of soil everywhere else. So you've got sort of a sodded turf on one side, sedum mat on the other side, and then there's spirobolus wrapping around the corner. But the idea is that you're sitting around this pool area, and if the pool gets really crowded, well, then you have this nice lawn space. You can throw out your towel or a blanket and kind of hang out there too. We also have this mound that wraps around that artificial turf fitness area that we looked at on the previous slide. So it just becomes kind of a fun way to add a little bit of dimension to the space. And as you're walking around, that it doesn't just feel like all one sort of flat experience, but it rises and falls and has different perspectives and spatial experiences as you walk around. So one of the strategies we employed here is we're trying to save some money with this developer, where as you can see, it was just a massive podium deck. And so when they priced out doing things like seat and mat in all of the unused spaces, it was, seat and mat was coming in at somewhere around $30 a square foot at the time, and it just was financially not realistic to do that. So what we proposed here that worked out pretty well was just doing a no-mow seed mix in all of those areas. You can do no-mow seed mix for about $2 a square foot, and in that no-mow fescue, which really I think blends in with a lot of the native plantings we're using elsewhere, but it's only mowed once a year. We will put in these sumacs in here, which are really shallow rooted, native tall shrubs, and this is all 12 inches of soil throughout. So the root ball is basically sitting right on top of the drainage mat below, and the roots can spread laterally through that space. But it's a way of adding some verticality, adding some interest, adding some habitat in there with the sumacs, but keeping the ground plane relatively inexpensive and have it still blend in with the rest of the surroundings. Another fun thing that's done here, I mentioned the crops that are grown here, but they actually really do this as part of a marketing strategy for the building too. So they grow things like cut flowers, as you can see up on the upper left, with the sunflowers and that kind of thing. But what they also do is they make gift baskets for prospective residents in the building, and also sell merchandise kind of within the building itself. So there's a an income generating potential there. They'll sell things like soaps and little jars of honey and candles made with beeswax and that kind of thing. They have beehives up on the buildings in these areas, as you can see in that bottom center image. And so the honey that's produced from that they use to make a variety of different products as part of the building. They also grow different herbs and vegetables and supply it to local restaurateurs. So they're getting this sort of fresh, sustainable produce to use at local restaurants. So it's supporting local economy. It's kind of giving back to the community. So beyond just the environmental aspect. It really becomes a nice marketing thing for the building, that hey, if you move in here, this building, they care about the rest of the community. They care about doing things in a sustainable way, and people oftentimes want to live that kind of lifestyle. They want to know that where they're living is contributing to the environment. And this building is actually a LEED Gold building as well. So the next project we wanted to look at is actually in the suburbs of Chicago. This is in Rolling Meadows, which is kind of a northwestern suburb of Chicago, and wanted to show this that hey, amenity decks don't only have to happen in dense urban downtown environments. They can happen in suburban places as well. So what you're seeing here, there's actually a parking garage below this entire space. So it's an at grade amenity deck. So you can walk in here right off of the parking lot, but it's all over structure. Um, so just to give you a sense of the transformation that was done, this was what it looked like when we first went onto the space. It was, virtually all concrete. There was a few little planters here and there, a bunch of kind of bolted down furnishings, but as you can see, not exactly an environment you probably would want to hang out in here as an employee. There's three towers here that are mostly kind of data oriented businesses. There's like a Verizon and a Komatsu call center here, and so the employees would kind of come down for lunch, but probably didn't want to hang out in the space so much. And then this is that same area afterwards. So we kind of reversed the figure ground and actually made it more green than gray. Tried to put as much planting as we could in here. Have lawn areas that are usable. This is all artificial turf with some real turf and some of the mounded areas at the edge. Kind of mixed in some fun furnishings throughout that are movable and a little more comfortable to sit on and more unexpected, like the orange lounge chairs, than something like a bolted down bench in a corporate environment. This again is a before shot of the east deck and then after in that same perspective. So it's you can just see the amount of green that even if you're not in the deck itself, if I'm sitting within any of the office spaces there, I just have now just a much nicer space to look out on. Just the kind of the restorative power of green spaces and plantings can really do wonders for people sitting in an office. This space here again, very gray, very bleak and transformed into a much greener space. We played a lot with grade change in here as well. So this space here is actually an elevated porch. This is 3 feet above the rest of the deck, so it's like a little place to hang out and just see things from a different perspective. I should also mention that this deck had a lot of structural limitations. This whole development was done in the 70s, and so a lot of the structure that was done below at first the structural engineer is kind of like nervous. I don't know if this can really accommodate all the stuff that you want to do. But just doing a few strategic things like locate the trees only on column lines. So the trees are actually all in a grid, but all the planting below is seen are a bit more informal and organic. Things like shade structures are landing only on columns, and we've tried to do everything in a playful way, but it's all really working with the structure below so that it can receive that capacity. Another sort of before and after effect there, going from gray to green, you can see that porch, elevation change transition that I mentioned earlier. This also has a really graphic approach to it. As I mentioned, the building was originally done in the 70s, and so we're trying to be sort of playful and do a pattern that was sort of reminiscent of 70s graphic design with these sort of arc and tangent, sort of burly marks effect throughout the space. So you create a lot of interesting little niches to hang out. So that you can have more intimate scale spaces and then more kind of communal scale spaces. It really also functions as an open air workplace, as an office environment. I think we particularly in Chicago saw this during COVID that a lot of people didn't want to be indoors, or a lot of buildings wouldn't even allow you to be indoors to meet together. But when you have an environment like this where you can, in fact, meet outdoors, or, collaborate with a coworker, we created spaces where you can plug in a laptop or a device outdoors, so that hey, I can work outside and I don't need to be kind of confined to a building. If it's a nice day during my lunch break, I want to do a little work or whatever, I can do that outside instead of being indoors. It's also a place for employees to decompress. So they do things like bags tournaments out there, or laying out in chaise lounges, and even in a corporate environment, it doesn't have to be all work all the time. If after you grab your lunch or before or after work. It's a place to hang out with your coworkers and relax a bit. We've really thought of this as sort of a modern meadow. There's a very kind of ornamental grass heavy palette here, not all native. And that's something I should mention too. With all the projects you're saying, there's a significant amount of native planting, but it's definitely not all native. We find with, as I mentioned before, a lot of developers, sometimes the perception can be that, oh, it's too weedy, too messy, and so a lot of times they want to see, maybe some brighter colors or a little bit of more refinement in certain areas. So we try to mix in natives and exotics together in a way that can kind of give the best of both worlds. Another thing that's happening here is sort of this invisible accessibility. Again, kind of talking to the social sustainable aspect of this. We want people in wheelchairs to feel like they have an equal, an equally nice experience to an able-bodied person. And so the access up to that porch level here happens, through this ramp that actually weaves up through the garden. It's not kind of like just a tacked on switchback ramp next to some stairs, which can kind of feel like oh, this is they just added this because they had to, or you feel like sort of a second class citizen having to take this. I think this is just as nice of an ascent up to that porch, walking through all this planting. I can touch things, I can smell things on my way up, and that can be, really nice for everyone. And this is also a real home for pollinators here. They also do some beekeeping here. They use this company that we use on quite a few projects, but they use Italian docile bees, which supposedly don't sting or don't really hurt much if they do. Um, so, I'm sure there's other bees and wasps and things that will infiltrate the area too. But we've tried to keep, heavily flowering materials sort of at the edges, away from kind of direct seating areas and things where you'd be kind of uncomfortable with bees sort of swarming around you, but still have them close enough where you can sort of, if you do like to watch bees and butterflies use or pollinate different flowers, you can see that happen as you walk by. The last project we wanted to talk about is a university project that's actually in design right now. This is at UW Madison. This is the Computer Data and Information Systems building that we're working on. So what you're seeing here in plan view is a new building, which is kind of the angular building that you're seeing in plan. There's a ground floor plaza space, but there's also two amenity decks, one on the third floor and one on the seventh floor. So interesting to see that green roofs are kind of making their way not only out of Chicago. Obviously, this is in Wisconsin, but also not only in apartment buildings or downtown office buildings, but actually in university higher ed projects as well. And so while this design maybe looks like a little kind of chaotic and what you're kind of seeing multiple different stories of building on top of each other. And the design aesthetic that we're going for here and that we've talked about with the client is really celebrating the nature of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a lot of beautiful natural areas and forests around the campus and prairies and all sorts of stuff like that. And so we wanted to again create a space where people really feel immersed in nature. So we have things like this elevated study deck zone where there's a counter for laptops and movable tables with trees overhead, but all the plantings here we have are about 90% native to Wisconsin. Um, and so, a mix of grasses and forbs and shrubs and trees and all sorts of different stuff. This is up on the third floor, kind of an ascent up to that elevated plane. Again, for if I'm in a wheelchair, I want to be able to access that space in a way that's still attractive and interesting. Here, as you can see, the student sitting off to the side in the planting, we've created these little like introvert, if you will, nooks off to the side where as I'm ascending up that ramp, I have these opportunities to step off to the side and be immersed in nature in a much more intimate environment than the more kind of public study deck space. And then the university really wanted this to be about visible sustainability. They wanted to show that, hey, this is a computer science building, and so technology and kind of thinking about the future is really important to the organization. And so they wanted the outdoor deck to really reflect that as well. So yes, while the plantings are intended to feel kind of very native and of Wisconsin history and character, there's things like a solar panel shade structure that you're seeing over there on the right that covers the space, that tells any visitor, coming here that, oh, okay, this university, this building is really about kind of celebrating that, and really want to put sustainability on display, and put energy conservation on display. And so we think that that contrast with all the stuff that celebrates technology inside of the building, having this contrast of this really kind of wild but architectural space at the same time, is a nice kind of juxtaposition between the two. So that is all I've got for today. If there are any questions, I am happy to answer some.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I had a couple questions on the first two projects. How long have they been up and running?
We finished Port Apartments in, I believe it was 2020. So it's been in the ground for a couple years at this point. Continental Towers was finished at right about the same time, so about 2 years.
Okay, cool. And have you found that the developers, like the ones that have been in place for longer, are there some any unique like maintenance issues related to the green roofs as they age?
Um, on Port Apartments, I forgot what the pest was. There was some sort of insect in the unmowed grass area. I can't even remember what it was at this point, but they were like, "Oh, what are these things? They're getting into people's units. How do we deal with that?" I'm like, "Well, you call a pest control company." Like, I don't know. I'm not a pest control expert. Um, and so it's there's some of that learning curve, like, yeah, of course, a natural space that has a lot of planting is going to attract insects. It's part of how it works. So
Oh, fun. Trying to set expectations there.
yeah.
Yeah. So Margot's got a question. It's a little on the long side, but it relates to experience been introducing green roofs to communities where they're new. She's
Mhm.
talking about yours have lots of amenities and things, but she's like worked on the first public green roof in Nashville where they are just interested in getting the roof to kind of blend in with the environment,
Mhm.
kind of a lower price point in the mid 80s. So I guess your experience working with those more basic roofs and also helping the community maybe get used to the idea.
Yeah, I think it's going to be something that comes up more and more as green roofs introduced to a lot of communities that haven't had them historically. I think it goes back to some of what I was talking about early on with really not only talking about the environmental aspect, but also like the economic and social benefits of those things. Because again, a lot of developers, or even a lot of communities, might just perceive a green roof as, okay, yeah, that's a nice, fuzzy green, crunchy granola thing to do. But is it, what are we really getting out of this sort of a scenario? But if you can say, well, hey, you're going to be saving, money because of the insulation of the building, that from a social aspect, okay, maybe if this is on a school, maybe there's an educational aspect for the, students who are uh, seeing the space where you can actually, teach them about something. Or it doesn't have to be a huge amenity space, but maybe there's something like the Chicago City Hall project I was talking about. It's like they take tour groups up there to take a look at it and see what they've done up there, but it's not really an occupiable amenity deck in the same way. So I think there's kind of that educational social aspect that's worth kind of talking about it, and seeing like there's a benefit beyond just the environmental stuff. And then just talking to about the, yeah, it's more money up front, but in the long run, you're saving money, you're conserving energy, all of that kind of stuff, and of course providing the environmental benefit too.
Christina wants to know, are most building owners or managers interested in making these spaces available to the general public, or most of them for tenants only?
Most of them are tenants only, but I would say in Chicago, like we've been working on quite a few publicly accessible like park and plaza spaces that are over structure.
Mhm.
So the image we're seeing on the screen, there's actually a big park right next to this that's all over a parking garage, and it actually most of the parks that you've probably think of when you think of Chicago, like Millennium Park and Maggie Daley Park, those are entirely over structure as well. And so I would say that that's more the publicly accessible side that we're seeing. It's usually bigger developments where maybe you've got people walking through that space or that kind of thing, but oftentimes they'll have a separate area that's more exclusive to their tenants or that kind of thing.
Very cool. Uh, Margaret had this question, and I kind of did too. How do you address the higher wind velocities at higher roof decks?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a few different ways. Usually above a certain elevation, we go from like a 42-inch parapet, which would be more typical around the edge of a building, to at least a 6-foot glass windscreen, sometimes 8 feet. And that's typically specified by the architect, but that helps temper the winds a little bit. Adding things like trees, shade structures, that kind of thing. Anything that kind of breaks up that wind can be helpful. We also do things like what you don't really see here, but is in fact there. So this is right along Lakeshore Drive. There's a lot of wind that comes off of the lake here, and the developer is really concerned about like, well, what if some of these lounge chairs fly off onto the highway and like kills someone on the way? But so all the furniture is actually tethered down here. So there's like a stainless steel cable that basically wraps around one of the legs of the chairs. It's anchored to the pavers, which all the pavers on this deck are 2 foot by 4 foot. And 2 3/4 inch thick, so they're really heavy pavers. They're like 300 pounds a piece. So they basically act as the tethering devices for the furniture that's out there too. So a few different ways we try to mitigate that. It's of course impossible to completely cut out the wind. I think the tallest one that I can remember us working on. We worked on a private residence on the top of the or one of the top floors of the new Vista Tower building, which I think it's the amenity deck is on the 71st floor. So the views are amazing up there, but it's like almost terrifying to be up that high, up at the edge of that deck up there. So we had to kind of we worked with like a wind engineer that kind of told us what we needed to do, but basically we had to pull all the amenity deck back from the edge something like 10 feet or something just to risk having anyone like fly off the edge. So
Definitely, yeah, unique constraints there.
mhm.
Um, Margaret also was curious. Do you have any photos of these spaces, what they look like in the wintertime that you might be able to
Um,
share with that?
I I would love to be able to share some. I don't know that we like a lot of times we don't take a lot of photos of them, but the winter aspect is a good thing to mention. I would say for apartment amenity decks in particular, like a lot of them are oriented around pools and that kind of thing. That's really the amenity most
Mhm.
developers are kind of selling with these decks. They're really perceived as primarily summer spaces because in Chicago, it's we kind of joke that um, that summer really starts around Easter or starts around Memorial Day, and winter really starts around Halloween. And so there's a very limited window that you can actually want to
Comfortably
hang.
being hooked in.
Right. And so, but the multi-seasonality of these spaces, like having things like fire pits that, okay, yeah, maybe in mid-July, if it's already, 90 degrees out, you might not want to sit around a fire, but in October, that becomes, a much more attractive space to hang out, but I'm probably not hanging out around the pool. So it's more kind of thinking about extending those shoulder seasons a little bit in early spring and fall, and using things like the ornamental grasses that'll provide some of that texture and what we always in our maintenance plans and whatnot suggest that they keep the grasses up and don't cut them down until early March. So that way you get the winter presents, things like incorporating, attractive foliage, whether it's birch or dogwood branches or that kind of thing to add a little bit of color. I would say there's not necessarily a ton of evergreen materials that we end up using in these spaces, more again because the developers, I think, realize that these are primarily used in the summer. And so when they're doing leasing tours and whatever, they're probably not walking people around the pool in January. And so it kind of it needs to be nice enough to view from the outside, but it doesn't necessarily need to be all about evergreens indoor when viewed from outside. So there's tends to be more kind of flowering plants and things that are going to look best in the summer. But that's a good thing to bring up because it does come up a lot. And I would say too, a lot of evergreens tend not to do super well in urban environments. There's only a handful of evergreen trees that I would even recommend using on an amenity deck. You saw a couple with juniper out there, which will do okay, but a lot of times things like even spruce or pines will just they tend to brown out with kind of too much pollution and wind and all that kind of stuff.
Be interesting to go visit the website for those apartments and see how they promote, in their images, if they, because I'm guessing they probably would promote the fire pits in the fall kind of thing too. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
not just the summer ones.
Well, and too, with doing project photography, it can be challenging too because it's a lot of these are private spaces, right? So it's like after we're done, designing the project and it's all constructed, it's like we've got to arrange. Okay, well, we need a site visit and access up to the building, and it's not always something that we're thinking about. And like, oh yeah, it's January, it's just snowed yesterday. Like, let's
Let's
go take
go
a
ask.
picture.
Yeah.
Um, so, but it's something we should have more of ultimately.
Yeah, I know that's always one of those things. The nature center that I run has a number of different features that were unique when it was built, and people are always asking, "Well, does anybody ever come back and see how they functioned in reality?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, "Well, yeah." So very cool.
Yeah,
Well,
I think
that's
too the graphic aspect I think is another thing to mention in the winter. I mean, as you could see from a couple of those projects, having something that really looks interesting from above, where maybe people are in their units during the winter and are probably not using the amenity deck much, it can still, having a really strong graphic makes something interesting to look at, even
yeah,
even if all the planting is dormant.
it's kind of a
Um,
neat art almost feel to it,
right.
even when it's not in use. Yeah, very nice.
Mhm.
All right. Well, unless anyone has a last minute question, I think we've come to the end of the questions that we've got so far. So, all right. If anyone does have more questions for Matt, his office hours are right after this at 9. So just click onto that session. Definitely do not forget to get your do your session evaluation. So we can give Matt some feedback on his presentation. And then our next set of sessions after the office hours start here at 9:30. So thank you everyone for your time and have a good rest of your morning.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Yay!